Something interesting happened just a few years ago, on January 13, 2018. What started out as a calm Saturday morning in Hawaii suddenly took a sharp turn. 8 minutes after 8 a.m., everyone's cell phones started blaring an alarm. TV broadcasts were interrupted. It was an urgent update from the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. When they checked their screens, what everyone then read was probably the last thing anybody expected. The message simply said, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill." You can imagine the panic that followed. Phone lines to emergency services and government offices became overwhelmed by frantic people trying to figure out what was happening. Others started preparing for what they thought was a legitimate nuclear attack. People were calling loved ones for one last goodbye, or spending what they thought could be their final moments with their family. One friend of mine, Jack, was there in Honolulu at a business conference, and he had left his hotel early to go walk along Waikiki Beach. His brother Rex called him after the alarm went out and told him he needed to get back to the hotel right away. Rex later said that Jack just kind of laughed and replied, "Why? I might as well stay here." My Marine friends were going wild on social media. I believe there was some kind of lockdown issued on all the bases. I wasn't on the island at the time, having left a few years earlier, but knowing how Marines are, if they were locked down in their barracks, my guess is that most of them started drinking early that day. But here's the thing. Hawaii wasn't in danger. There wasn't a missile or meteor or any threat whatsoever. Turns out it was just a big mix-up, a simple miscommunication during what was supposed to be a routine test of Hawaii's emergency alert system. With all the recent tensions between North Korea and the United States at the time, you can't blame people for thinking World War III had finally kicked off. But they were wrong. It was just a massive screw-up that, with the help of social media, spread panic and confusion all over the Hawaiian Islands and beyond. And as expected, people were pissed. Now, looking back, everyone kind of laughed it off. A lot of memes got passed around with images of a mushroom cloud over Honolulu, but at the time the alarms were going off, everyone was legitimately freaked out. And funnily enough, this kind of thing has happened before, except that the threat wasn't an incoming nuclear bomb. 80 years earlier, on October 30th, 1938, the day before Halloween, when many American homes still didn't have a television, thousands of people were tuning into their nightly radio programs. With the expansion of Nazi Germany happening in the late 30s and the Japanese invasions into China, Americans were aware of the growing threat of totalitarian regimes. So suffice it to say, a lot of people took it very seriously when the frantic announcers for the Columbia Broadcasting System abruptly came on the air to announce that the United States was being invaded. Listeners waited with bated breath to find out more information about the attack. Was it the Germans? Far from it. In fact, they soon realized that the invaders weren't even from this planet. This is the story of the War of the Worlds, the radio broadcast that terrified America.
Wallen Studios and its affiliated stations are proud to present Luke LaManna's Wartime Stories. Ladies and gentlemen, the producer of Wartime Stories and the host of these broadcasts, Luke LaManna.
The late 1930s was an interesting time for many Americans. The economy had somewhat bounced back from the darkest days of the Great Depression, but now there was another growing sense of unease. Tensions were rising in both Europe and the Pacific, and people were paying close attention. While millions read the morning papers over breakfast, millions more were tuning into news broadcasts on a nightly basis, keeping up to date with current events through their radio sets. From their living rooms, they listened anxiously as the Japanese launched their second invasion of China in 1937. Then, as the summer turned to autumn in 1938, it looked as if Nazi Germany was preparing to invade Czechoslovakia. Families huddled around their home radios, listening for any breaking developments. For weeks, negotiators from Britain and France were attempting to appease Hitler in hopes of avoiding another global war. And on September 30th, 1938, it seemed they finally had. It was announced that Britain, France, Germany, and Italy had signed off on the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia was forced to hand over large amounts of territory, but war, for the moment, had been avoided. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, even declared that they had secured peace in our time. While many people hoped that the Munich Agreement would ensure continued peace in Europe, many more were unsure if Hitler would respect the terms of the treaty. Even so, despite the growing anxiety over world events, there was something in the air on the evening of October 30th, 1938, a buzz of excitement. It was the night before Halloween, and all across the country, people were getting into the spirit of the holiday. It was also a Sunday night. With work and school the next morning, most families had settled in for a quiet evening at home, ready to unwind with some good old-fashioned radio entertainment.
We take you now to the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York, where you will be entertained by the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
While radio was fast becoming the go-to source for breaking news in the late 1930s, this wasn't called the golden age of radio for nothing. Stations like CBS, NBC, and MBS also offered listeners a wide array of entertainment programs. Some of the best listening you can still find even today. Everything from live comedy and musical performances to children's shows, talk shows, and dramatic stories. Fibber McGee and Molly, The Aldrich Family, Archie, Lights Out, The Lone Ranger, and one of my all-time favorites, The Shadow. One of the most popular shows at the time was the Chase and Sanborn Hour, a live comedy and variety show hosted by ventriloquist Edgar Bergen. The show aired every Sunday at 8 p.m. on NBC, and the evening of October 30th was no different. As Bergen took the show into its first commercial break, with advertisers promoting their preferred brands of tobacco, tires, and blue coal, a lot of listeners did what people still do today during ads. They started scrolling through the other channels to see what else was playing. Many of them landed on CBS, where a live broadcast was already underway from the Meridian Room of New York City's Hotel Park Plaza. The program featured composer Raymond Raquello and his big band orchestra as they kicked off the evening with some upbeat melodies.
Come on. Stupid thing.
You almost done down there, Dad? I want to catch the rest of the Chase and Sanborn Hour.
There'll be plenty of time for radio when we get this bucket of bolts working. Now, hand me the wrench, would you? What the hell is wrong with this thing? Fresh off the lot and it craps out on me.
Should have gone with the Ford, like Grandpa Rick said.
What was that?
Nothing, Dad.
Jerry! Jerry! Jerry, come quick!
Good God, Beth! What is it?
The man on the radio. He's saying something just crashed over at Grover's Mill.
What?
Something from space, Jerry. From Mars.
Midway through the orchestral performance, the CBS broadcast launched into a series of breaking news updates. A Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory near Chicago, Illinois, had reported observing several explosions of blue gas on the surface of Mars. The explosions in question occurred at regular intervals and were thought to be the result of hydrogen gas. Quoting the professor, the announcer described the phenomenon as a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, which was now moving towards Earth at a high velocity. This first report, while strange to some and interesting to others, was no cause for alarm. The news update ended, and listeners were quickly returned to the scheduled program of music. But this only continued for a short moment before the broadcast cut out once again. The second interruption alerted listeners that CBS was receiving another update, this time from the Princeton Observatory in New Jersey. CBS correspondent Carl Phillips was reporting live from the observatory, speaking with world-famous astronomer Professor Pearson. Looking through the observatory's telescope, Pearson also described a strange series of explosions happening on the surface of Mars. Phillips probed him with questions, ultimately inferring that these explosions might be a sign of living intelligence. Pearson wasn't sure what they were seeing, but he was quick to say that the odds of life existing on Mars were 1,000 to 1. Phillips then asked Pearson about the distance between Earth and Mars, to which Pearson calmly replied that Mars was about 40 million miles away. "Well," said Phillips, "that seems a safe enough distance." The interview was then cut off. There was a brief silence hanging over the airwaves for a few seconds before the voice of Carl Phillips returned. He explained that someone had just handed Professor Pearson an urgent message. He then asked the professor's permission to read it to the audience.
Quote, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed, Lloyd Gray, Chief of Astronomical Division. Unquote.
This announcement was followed by a stunned silence before Phillips asked the question that was now on every listener's mind. Could this earthquake be connected with the strange explosions seen on the Martian surface? Professor Pearson wasn't convinced. He said it was likely just a meteor impact, and its arrival alongside the unexplained activity on Mars was likely pure coincidence. With that, Phillips signed off, returning listeners to that night's regularly scheduled musical program. Husbands and wives now sat in their living rooms, staring at the radio set with a funny expression. Children sat quietly in front of the set, looking back at their parents, waiting for them to explain what was happening. But before anyone could say Hoot Gibson, another urgent update came through. Authorities in Trenton, New Jersey were now reporting that a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, had crashed into a farmer's field in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill. Correspondent Carl Phillips was already on his way to the scene with a mobile unit. Then, just as abruptly as before, listeners were brought back to the night's musical performance. By this point, everyone tuned into the CBS broadcast was glued to their radios, waiting in suspense for the next update. Nobody spun the dials during commercials. Nobody wanted to miss a word of the next update, which could come at any moment. And nobody was paying attention to the music anymore. Word was starting to spread fast. Listeners were calling their friends and family. Radios across America and even Canada were switching stations to tune into CBS, all waiting to find out what in the world was happening over in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. When Carl Phillips came back on the air, his voice was noticeably shaken and slightly difficult to hear above the din of police sirens and what was evidently an excited crowd of onlookers now gathering at Grover's Mill. Phillips attempted to describe to all the waiting listeners what they were looking at in the farmer's field.
Well, I hardly know where to begin. To paint for you a word picture of the strange scene before my eyes like something out of a modern Arabian Nights. Well, I just got here. I haven't had a chance to look around yet. I guess that's it. Yes, I guess that's the thing directly in front of me. Half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force. The ground is covered with splinters of a tree. It must have struck on its way down. But I can see the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor. At least not the meteors I've seen. It looks more like a huge cylinder. Has a diameter of, what would you say, Professor Pearson?
What's that?
What would you say, what's the diameter of this?
About 30 yards.
About 30 yards. The metal on the...
After a brief interview with the man who witnessed the arrival of the object, Phillips drew attention to a series of strange humming and scraping sounds. They seemed to be coming from inside the cylinder, which listeners could also faintly hear through his microphone. When asking Professor Pearson about the sounds, the astronomer said they could be due to the object cooling down after falling from space.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see its cylindrical shape.
Something's happening.
It was here that Phillips' attention was drawn to some sort of mechanical movement coming from the cylinder. As he started reporting on this, listeners hundreds of miles away understood what was happening before anyone else did. Something was alive inside that cylinder, and it was trying to get out. With one half of the cylinder buried deep in the crater, its exposed end began to slowly rotate like a screw. Listeners at home now heard the sounds of panicked voices and the shouts of police officers trying to maintain order. Suddenly, the top of the cylinder popped loose and fell into the crater.
Take off! The top blew! Look out, man! Stand back! Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone calling someone or something, I can see, coming out of that black hole, two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost... Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. I can see the thing's body. Now it's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but face, ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are...
As the crowd of onlookers retreated from the capsule, Phillips shouted into the microphone that he was going to find a better vantage point. The broadcast then abruptly cut out. The ominous silence, now hanging in everyone's living room, was once again broken by the rather whimsical piano music. The effect was deeply ironic. The sheer suspense and tension on the faces huddled around their radios stood in sharp contrast to the lighthearted music now filling the room. The seconds ticked by. The music was almost agonizing to listen to. Suddenly, Phillips' voice once again cut through. He sounded breathless as he described the scene around him. The group had pulled back to observe the object and its alien occupant from a safe distance, and more state police officers had arrived to take control of the situation. Cautiously advancing towards the pit were 3 policemen. Phillips told listeners that one of them was waving a small white flag in an attempt to make contact with the strange creature. It was sensational. The people of Earth were making first contact with a visitor from Mars.
Object while the captain and 2 policemen advanced with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Oh my God.
Should we call someone?
Yes, Jerry. Call the police.
All right. Everybody just calm down. I'm sure this is just one big misunderstanding. Now, Beth, sweetie, get my gun.
What do you want the gun for, Rick?
I didn't fight my way across France just to get killed by some space octopus in a tin can, Jerry. If we die tonight, we die like men.
Aw, jeez, Grandpa.
By this point in the broadcast, the mood had shifted completely. Whatever the Sunday night patrons of CBS were expecting, their bewilderment was now turning into something much more serious, a full-blown panic. Telephones at local police and radio broadcasting stations were ringing off the hook. Families and friends were frantically calling each other to pass information about the invasion or to ask for it. As American homes buzzed with fear and excitement, their conversations were cut short when the CBS broadcast buzzed back to life. But this time, it wasn't Carl Phillips. This new voice didn't introduce himself, but he sounded both somber and urgent. He announced that 40 men, including reporter Carl Phillips, now lay dead on Grover's Mill, all of them burned to death by some kind of heat ray weapon.
I have been requested by the governor of New Jersey to place the counties of Mercer and Middlesex as far west as Princeton and east to Jamesburg under martial law. No one will be permitted to enter this area except by a special pass issued by state or military authorities. 4 companies of state militia are proceeding from Trenton to Grover's Mill and will aid in the evacuation of homes within the range of military operations. Thank you.
With a force of 7,000 troops, the state militia locked down the entire area around Grover's Mill. Broadcasting live from the militia's field headquarters, the voice of Captain Lansing of the Signal Corps kept the listening audience updated on the situation.
A cylindrical object which lies in a pit directly below our position, surrounded on all sides by 8 battalions of infantry, without heavy field pieces but adequately armed with rifles and machine guns. All cause for alarm, if such cause ever existed, is now entirely unjustified. Things, whatever they are, do not even venture to poke their heads above the pit. I can see their hiding place plainly in the glare of the searchlights here. With all their reported resources, these creatures can scarcely stand up against heavy machine gun fire. Anyway, it's an interesting outing for the troops. I can make out their khaki uniforms crossing back and forth in front of the lights. Looks almost like a real war. There appears to be some slight smoke in the woods bordering the Millstone River, probably fire started by campers. Well, we ought to see some action soon. One of the companies is deploying on the left flank. A quick thrust and it'll all be over. Now, wait a minute, I see something on top of the cylinder. No, it's nothing but a shadow. Now the troops are on the edge of the Wilmot Farm. 7,000 armed men closing in on an old metal tube. A tub, rather. Well, wait, that wasn't a shadow, it's something moving. Solid metal, kind of a shield-like affair rising up out of the cylinder. It's going higher and higher. What? It's standing on legs, actually rearing up on a sort of metal framework. Now it's reaching above the trees and the searchlights are on it. Hold on.
Captain Lansing was suddenly cut off, the broadcast going dead once again. When the announcer finally came back, the news was grim. Emerging from the crater in a massive, 3-legged machine, a single Martian had managed to nearly wipe out the entire force of 7,000 state militia soldiers, and now it was on the move. As the machine cut across New Jersey, it began destroying railroad tracks and power lines with its heat ray, disrupting communications and troop movements all over the state. With the broadcast continuing to provide updates to listeners at home, the scene painted by the CBS announcer was bleak. Highways were becoming jammed with panicked mobs attempting to flee the Martian advance. Martial law was declared across New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania, and the invasion was only mounting. More and more cylinders were being discovered all over the eastern seaboard, their tripod fighting vehicles now emerging to join in the destruction. Nearby observatories were reporting that more explosions were being seen on the Martian surface. As the situation escalated, the Secretary of the Interior himself joined the broadcast, speaking live from Washington, D.C. He urged listeners to stay calm, but also emphasized the urgent need for action against the Martian threat. By this point, as many as 2 million people had tuned in from across the country, and while listeners were becoming more and more frantic, one thing was clear: calm was no longer an option. An alien invasion of America, perhaps the entire world, was underway. After the devastating loss at Grover's Mill, military forces scrambled to mount a defense against the advancing Martians. A number of the enemy machines had since linked up and were now marching across New Jersey, heading straight for New York City. If they weren't already scrambling to find shelter and load their guns, listeners tuned into the broadcast were on the edge of their seats as the report about the soldiers making a desperate stand crackled through their sets. The battle was brutal, and it was clear from the start that the odds were stacked in favor of the aliens. Artillery gunners choked to death live on air as they were overcome by toxic black gas deployed by the Martians, while a squadron of Army bombers was knocked out of the sky during an attack on one of the enemy machines. Against all odds, one Martian war machine was finally destroyed, but only at great cost. A squadron leader had flown his burning aircraft directly into the enemy, killing himself and his crew. It was a small victory. The Martians seemed unstoppable as they continued to smash through every line of defense. And it wasn't long before they were standing on the banks of the Hudson River, the New York City skyline just a short distance away.
New York Central Police Station. Can you hold, please? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Ma'am, please, slow down. I can assure you there's no gas attack here in New York. There's no need to worry. I understand that, ma'am. rest assured, we are trying to get to the bottom of it. I'm sure that your daughter is safe and sound. So please just remain calm. Okay. Take care. My God. What is all this about Martians and gas and big walking bar stools? The phones have been going nonstop. You ever seen anything like this, sir?
No, I have not. This is being broadcast on what? CBS? No other stations are carrying it?
It looks that way. At least that's what folks are saying.
All right. Let's get some units down to their office at 485 Madison Avenue. I think they have some explaining to do.
As listeners around the country sat glued to their radios to hear the latest news about the destruction of New York City by Martians, police dispatch centers and newspaper offices all over the states of New York and New Jersey were being overwhelmed by thousands of frantic callers. Since many of the operators picking up the phones weren't aware of the CBS broadcast, it was hard to make sense of what people were shouting about. Callers were asking how to prepare for gas attacks, evacuation protocols, the status of loved ones, and panicking about invading Martians. In the confusion, a few people calling the police even seemed to think the country was under attack by Germans. A few off-duty National Guardsmen were even reported to have rushed to their nearby armory to report for duty, asking fellow soldiers about the massacre at Grover's Hill and the ongoing fighting. Through all the confusion, one clear fact emerged. The only radio station carrying this story was CBS, with NBC and other affiliate networks airing their usual programs. It was only CBS who was reporting about the Martian Attack. With thousands of people on the brink of all-out panic, the New York Police Department mustered a few units and sent them to the CBS radio studios at 485 Madison Avenue to figure out what the hell was going on.
Listening to a CBS presentation of Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in an original dramatization of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The performance will continue after a brief intermission. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
And cut. Roll the commercial.
All right, that's intermission, people. Let's get refreshed. We are back on in 10.
Orson? A quick word, please.
What's the matter, Taylor? You're pale as a sheet.
Yeah, it's bad, Orson. We may have screwed up. The police are here.
The police? Well, what about till now?
As the broadcast entered its first intermission, Orson Welles couldn't have been happier with how the night's show was coming together. It was an ambitious project, but everyone from the actors to the sound engineers and musicians was performing at the top of their game. Though only 23 years of age, Welles had already built a reputation in the New York Broadway scene as a protege and visionary storyteller, establishing himself as one of the top playwrights, directors, and actors of his time. He was so successful and popular that CBS agreed to give him his own hour in the evening lineup known as the Mercury Theater on the Air. Airing every Sunday at 8 p.m., the Mercury Theater gave Welles complete creative freedom to stage elaborate retellings of famous plays and novels. And since first airing in September 1938, the show had gone on to generate a relatively small but loyal following. After wrapping up a production of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days on October 23rd, Welles had something special in mind for the following week's episode. It would be airing the night before Halloween, and Welles wanted to do something a little bit more scary. A production of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. When H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds first appeared in magazines in 1897, it absolutely terrified readers. Up until that point, nobody had really thought about the possibility of advanced life on other planets, let alone the idea of aliens coming to Earth and wiping out humanity. By the 1930s, Wells's story was a bona fide science fiction classic, but Orson Welles, the ambitious storyteller that he was, wanted to update the story for a modern American audience. In Wells's mind, the original novel format was a bit too dull and didn't lend itself well to a radio drama. He wanted to find a way to make it more intense. So he made some big changes. The setting changed from England to America, and working alongside writer Howard Koch and producer John Houseman, Wells restructured the story as a realistic news broadcast. They featured eyewitness reports, sound effects, live updates from the front lines, and referenced real locations and institutions, all to make the Martian invasion feel as authentic as possible. When an early draft of the script was sent to CBS executive producer Davidson Taylor, he was a little bit concerned. He liked the idea of a fake radio broadcast, but the way it came off was almost a little too real. At his suggestion, the writers toned down the realism by changing the names of certain organizations and locations. But as the show played out on the evening of October 30th, 1938, it looked like Taylor's concerns about the script's realism were pretty valid. The first sign that something was wrong came around the halfway point of the show. Just a few minutes before the intermission, Davidson Taylor, who was watching the production alongside John Houseman in the studio control room, was pulled away by an urgent telephone call. When he returned a few minutes later, Houseman recalled Taylor looking pale as death. Apparently, he'd just been ordered to stop the show and alert the audience that it was all a work of fiction. But as Houseman asked about what was going on, actor Ray Collins was already in the process of choking to death, live on air, on the Martian gas that, at that very moment, was supposedly flooding New York City. In what had to be one of the greatest moments in radio history, Houseman and Taylor came to the realization that people were taking their fictional radio show very seriously. Just outside the studio doors, a crowd of reporters and police officers had started gathering. The NYPD was threatening to shut down the entire broadcast. In the ensuing scuffle, the studio staff managed to keep the police at bay until 9 p.m., when the show concluded. But the second Orson Welles signed off, a mob of police officers busted through the studio doors. Confused and caught off guard by the police's entrance, Welles, Houseman, and Taylor were taken to another floor and locked in a back room. In a later interview, Houseman described the chaos that followed.
The following hours were a nightmare. The building was suddenly full of people and dark blue uniforms. Hustled out of the studio, we were locked into a small back office on another floor. Here we sat incommunicado while network employees were busily collecting, destroying, or locking up all scripts and record of the broadcast. Finally, the press was let loose upon us, ravening for horror. How many deaths had we heard of, implying they knew of thousands? What do we know of the fatal stampede in a Jersey hall, implying it was one of many? What traffic deaths? The ditches must be choked with corpses. People offing themselves. Haven't you heard about the one on Riverside Drive? It is all quite vague in my memory and quite terrible.
To say that the three men were horrified was an understatement. They couldn't understand how their radio drama managed to cause such chaos. As mandated, the Mercury Theater had announced its production of War of the Worlds 4 times over the course of the hour-long broadcast, once at the beginning, before and after the intermission, and once more at the end. It's not like they were actually trying to fool anyone into thinking it was all real. But for the many thousands who tuned in after these announcements were made, or possibly missed hearing them while they were frantically spinning the dial on their phones, the show sounded like an actual news broadcast of America being invaded. Some people who tuned in late even missed the whole Martian angle, which is why they told police they thought they were being bombed by the Germans. Paul White, then the head of CBS News, rushed to the office after hearing about the situation. It was there, in the middle of all this mayhem, that he recalled coming across Orson Welles.
The telephone switchboard, a vast sea of light, could only handle a fraction of incoming calls. The haggard Welles sat alone and despondent. "I'm through," he lamented, "washed up." I didn't bother to reply to this highly inaccurate self-appraisal. I was too busy writing explanations to put on the air, reassuring the audience that it was safe. I also answered my share of incessant telephone calls, many of them from as far away as the Pacific coast.
When the sun rose on Monday morning, Orson Welles was probably the most talked about man in America. The man himself had dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept at all that night. What between the emergency CBS press conference that followed his release from the back room, followed by an all-night rehearsal for another play that he would be performing in. Wells wasn't the only one pulling an all-nighter. Reporters were rushing to get the scoop on the story. The October 31st edition of the New York Times ultimately captured the true scale of the panic that had spread across the entire country, and even into parts of southern Canada. The article detailed how police and newspaper offices were overwhelmed with calls, how citizens reportedly fled their homes in a frenzy, the rioting in the streets, flooding of police stations, people arming themselves and creating massive traffic jams in their attempts to escape the Martians. Many even piled into churches and places of worship to pray, believing it was the end of the world. But the worst was finding out about the numerous deaths that the panic was reported to have caused. The show's news broadcast style was apparently so realistic that people were said to have collapsed from heart attacks and strokes, with thousands more being admitted to hospitals in a state of shock. Even more disturbing were the stories of people taking their own lives. Some were so terrified of being killed by the Martians that they decided to go out on their own terms. One report from the New York Times described a man in Pittsburgh who said he'd returned home during the broadcast to find his wife in the bathroom. She was holding a bottle of poison in her hand and screaming, "I'd rather die this way than like that." Once the panic died down, public fear quickly turned to public anger. This was especially directed at Orson Welles. People felt that it was cruel and irresponsible for him to portray the story in such a realistic way, especially given the wartime anxieties many Americans were already feeling. Some even went as far as complaining directly to the Federal Communications Commission, demanding for more restrictions on what could be said and done on the radio. In spite of the backlash, there were also many people who had no complaints, but in fact absolutely loved the broadcast. Not only did they applaud Welles for his visionary storytelling, but they were also strongly against the idea of censoring radio in any form. They were also baffled at how anyone could be fooled by a radio show with such an outlandish premise. One of those defenders was singer and actor Eddie Cantor, who sent a telegram to the FCC saying,
"The Mercury Theater drama was a melodramatic masterpiece. Censorship would retard radio immeasurably and produce a spineless radio theater as unbelievable as the script of the War of the Worlds."
Another letter to the commission came from J.B. Yawkey of South Dakota. He also praised Wells's show, while simultaneously poking fun at the hysterics it generated.
"I suppose that by this time you have received many letters from numerous cranks and crackpots who quickly became jitterbugs during the program. I was one of the thousands who heard this program and did not jump out of the window, did not attempt off myself, did not break my arm while beating a hasty retreat from my apartment, did not anticipate a horrible death, did not hear the Martians rapping on my chamber door, did not see the monsters landing in warlike regalia in the park across the street, but sat serenely entertained to no end by the fine portrayal of a fine play."
Then there was Mrs. Lillian Davenport of Texarkana, Texas, who wrote the FCC simply saying,
"How anyone with the intelligence, above that of a 2-year-old child, could be frightened by the broadcast is utterly incomprehensible."
By autumn the next year, Hitler had invaded Poland, the world was pitched into another massive war, and all complaints about the War of the Worlds broadcast were forgotten. Ultimately, the broadcast and the mayhem that it caused became the stuff of legend, but the true scale of the panic is often thought to be blown way out of proportion. While police and newspapers were actually swamped by thousands of calls in relation to the broadcast, especially in New York and New Jersey, many of the reports of mass hysteria, rioting, car wrecks, injuries, and death caused by the panic went largely unverified by the press. Despite the claims that hospitals were being flooded with casualties as a result of the show, records from those hospitals were unable to verify this, at least according to research conducted by Princeton University professor Hadley Cantrell. It is otherwise believed that the big newspapers at the time deliberately fanned the flames of misinformation to sell their own papers and to undermine the credibility of broadcast journalism. By the late 1930s, radio was rapidly becoming America's primary source for news, with nearly 27 million families across the country owning radio sets, and that number was only getting bigger. With the rise of the radio industry, millions of dollars worth of advertising revenue that once went to print journalism was now going into broadcasting. Talk about wartime stories of an unconventional kind. In what could be described as a media turf war, newspapers turned Wells's broadcast into a prime example of why radio news couldn't be trusted. But these attempts to undermine their competition were as successful as the horse dealers' attempts were to call the automobile a passing fad. There was no stopping radio, and more specifically, there was no stopping Orson Welles. The whole incident only solidified his reputation as a master storyteller. Soon after, he was signed by Hollywood's RKO Pictures, where he would go on to write, direct, and star in what many would later consider to be one of the greatest films ever made, 1941's Citizen Kane. Despite his incredible success, the War of the Worlds broadcast would shadow Welles for much of his career. When reporters would ask him about it, he would sometimes play into the myths surrounding the broadcast. But it wasn't lost on him that people's fear of war around that time was very real and certainly fed into their reactions. In a 1958 BBC interview, as he reflected on the impact of the War of the Worlds broadcast and the 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor, Welles recalled the exact moment he learned that America was under attack.
I was in the midst of some hymn of praise to the American cornfields or something of the kind when suddenly a gentleman darted into the radio studio, held up his hand and said, "We interrupt this broadcast to bring you an announcement. Pearl Harbor has just been attacked." Of course, this very serious and terrible news was never believed. Not for hours by anybody in America, because they all said, well, there he goes again, really. All the bad taste was funny once, but not a second time.
Hey guys, thank you for sticking around for the after action here in the credits. I could offer my own thoughts about the War of the Worlds broadcast, but while I still had your attention captive just for a couple of minutes, I wanted to introduce you to something that, if you haven't had an opportunity to check it out yet, you might find interesting, and I'm going to be the one to send you down this rabbit hole. I grew up without a TV, and it was something my parents just thought would be good for us. So it was like growing up out of time for me, because I was in the 90s as a kid listening to old-time radio shows. That's what my parents gave me to listen to, and going out in the woods and climbing trees and playing Davy Crockett. So it was hard getting along with kids in school who were talking about all the stuff they were watching, and I was like talking about The Shadow, and they had no idea. But if you haven't checked out old-time radio yet, who knows? Maybe you'll fall in love with it like I have. There's so many great shows to listen to, and even the advertisements from 90 years ago were fun to listen to, hearing what show sponsors were promoting to their audiences in the 1930s and 40s. Just really sends you back in time when people had to heat their homes with coal furnaces, save money with war bonds, and so on. As I mentioned, one of my favorite shows was called The Shadow, a radio series about a wealthy man about town named Lamont Cranston, who, having spent years studying mysticism in the Orient, he comes back to New York and becomes a crime fighter. He uses hypnotic powers to keep people from seeing him, and is then able to become invisible and hide in the shadows. Interestingly enough, Orson Welles was the first to play the voice of the Shadow when the show aired in 1937. He was on the show for the first year, and then the last episode he worked on, Professor X, aired in September 1938. And now I know why. Orson had just started on his new show, the CBS Mercury Theater, on the air that same month, so he must have had to leave The Shadow to focus on the new show. And just a few weeks after he recorded this last Shadow episode, in September, is when the War of the Worlds broadcast happened at the end of October. Interesting piece of radio history there. I hope you enjoyed listening. Aside from old-time radio shows from the 1930s and 40s, some shows that might align with your interests, with stories about the paranormal and strange mysteries, would be X-1, I believe it was from the 1950s, CBS Radio Mystery Theater, which was the 1960s and 70s when they tried to bring radio back, which I thought they did a great job with. You can find all of these shows to listen to free online. Many of them are here on YouTube. They're not hard to track down. I'll post the names of the shows in the information section of this video. Thank you for listening, for watching, for subscribing, liking, leaving a comment, everything you guys do to support the channel and allow us to keep doing what we do here at Wartime Stories. As always, a huge shout out to both my patrons and YouTube channel members for your incredible support. May God be with each and every one of you, no matter what you are dealing with, and I will see you in the next episode.